In the summer of 1952, a social worker named Margaret Hensley drove her government-issued Ford down a winding dirt road deep into the Kentucky mountains. She was following up on reports that had crossed her desk 3 times, reports that kept getting buried, filed away. Forgotten reports about a family living in complete isolation, about children who looked too much alike, about a woman who had borne sons by her own brother. When Margaret finally reached the weathered cabin tucked into those shadowed hollows, what she found would haunt her for the rest of her life. She discovered Lily Macombs, a woman trapped in a nightmare that had consumed 3 generations of her bloodline, a woman whose story the state of Kentucky would spend decades trying to erase. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about the most cursed daughter in Kentucky's history, a woman whose name was deliberately scrubbed from public records, whose children were scattered to the winds, whose very existence became a shameful secret that entire communities agreed to forget. This is the story of Lily Macombs and the bloodline that should never have been. What you're about to hear isn't just a tale of family dysfunction or mountain folklore. This is documented history that powerful people worked very hard to bury. Court records that were sealed, birth certificates that were altered, entire family trees that were systematically destroyed. Because sometimes the truth is so dark, so disturbing that society decides it's better left buried in the shadows. But shadows have a way of bleeding through. The Macombs family had been living in the remote hollows of eastern Kentucky since before the Civil War. They were what the locals called ridge runners, families who carved out their existence in places so isolated that the outside world simply forgot they existed. No roads led to their settlements. No mail was delivered. No census takers bothered to count them among the living. Samuel Combs built his homestead in 1847 on a plot of land so remote that it didn't appear on any official map. He brought with him his wife Martha and their 3 children. But isolation has a way of breeding its own kind of darkness. When Martha died during a harsh winter in 1863, Samuel made a decision that would curse his bloodline for generations to come. Rather than remarry or send his daughter away, Samuel kept 15-year-old Mary Ellen close, too close. By 1864, Mary Ellen had given birth to her first child, a son whose father's name was never recorded in any official document. The local preacher, if he knew, said nothing. The neighbors, what few there were, turned their eyes away. Mary Ellen would bear Samuel 3 more children before his death in 1878. But the pattern had been set, the bloodline already poisoned. When Mary Ellen's eldest son, Thomas, came of age, he never left the hollow. He never married outside the family. Instead, he followed the only example he had ever known. Thomas took his own sister, Rebecca, as his wife in everything but name. No ceremony was performed, no license was filed. They simply lived as husband and wife in that same isolated cabin, raising children who would never know that other families didn't live this way. Children who thought it was normal for fathers and uncles to be the same person. By 1920, the Combs family tree had become so tangled, so inbred that tracking the actual bloodlines required investigators to create special charts that would later be classified and hidden in state archives. The children born into this cursed lineage suffered from afflictions that medical professionals of the time couldn't fully understand: mental disabilities, physical deformities, and a kind of psychological damage that seemed to pass from generation to generation like a genetic curse. And then came Lily Mae, born in 1925 to parents who were also siblings raised in a world where the lines between family roles had been blurred beyond recognition. Lily Macombs entered this world on a cold October night in 1925, delivered by her own grandmother in a cabin that reeked of kerosene and desperation. From the moment she drew her first breath, she was marked by the sins of her bloodline. Her eyes were too close together, a telltale sign of the genetic damage that ran through her family like poison in a well. Growing up in the hollow, Lily Mae knew only one reality: her father James was also her uncle. Her mother Sarah was both her parent and her cousin. The children in the cabin called each other brother and sister, but their relationships were far more complex and disturbing than those simple words could convey. By the time Lily Mae was 8 years old, she had learned to avoid her father's attention when the sun went down. She had learned to make herself small, invisible when the adults gathered around the wood stove and passed around mason jars of corn liquor. She had learned that screaming brought no help, because in their isolated world there was no one to hear and no one who would care if they did. The family survived on what they could hunt, trap, and grow in the Rocky Mountain soil. They had no electricity, no running water, no connection to the outside world, except for the occasional visit from a traveling preacher who took one look at the hollow-eyed children and decided his services weren't needed there. Even God, it seemed, had abandoned this place. Education was non-existent. Lily Mae never learned to read or write, beyond scratching her name in the dirt with a stick. She never learned that there was a world beyond the ridges, where families lived differently, where fathers didn't look at their daughters with hungry eyes, where children weren't born already broken by the sins of their ancestors. When Lily Mae turned 12, her childhood, what little innocence remained, came to an abrupt and violent end. Her older brother, William, had been watching her with the same predatory intensity that seemed to run in the men of their bloodline. One autumn night in 1937, while their parents lay in a drunken stupor, William decided to claim what he believed was his birthright. The pattern that had poisoned their family for 3 generations was about to claim another victim, and this time, it would produce offspring that would horrify even the social workers who thought they had seen everything the mountains could hide. By the spring of 1938, 13-year-old Lily Mae's body began showing the unmistakable signs of what her brother had done to her. In the outside world, this would have triggered investigations, arrests, interventions, but in the hollow, it was simply Tuesday. Her mother, Sarah, herself a victim of the same cycle, said nothing. Her father, James, who had committed identical sins with his own sisters, pretended not to notice. The family closed ranks around their shared darkness, creating a wall of silence that would protect their secrets for over a decade. Lily Mae's first son was born in November 1938, delivered on the same blood-stained mattress where she had been born 13 years earlier. The child emerged with severe deformities. His skull was misshapen, his limbs twisted at unnatural angles. He would never walk, never speak, never develop beyond the mental capacity of an infant. The family called him Little Samuel, though no birth certificate was ever filed. William, emboldened by the family's acceptance of his actions, continued to use his sister as he pleased. By 1940, Lily Mae had given birth to a second son. This child, whom they named Thomas after his great-grandfather, appeared more physically normal, but exhibited disturbing behavioral patterns from early childhood. He would rock himself violently for hours, bang his head against the cabin walls until blood ran down his face, and make sounds that barely qualified as human language. The isolation that had once protected the Coombs family's secrets was beginning to crack. World War II had brought government attention to even the most remote corners of Appalachia. Draft boards were looking for young men. Social services were expanding their reach. Rationing programs required registration and documentation. In 1943, a census taker named Robert Glenn ventured into the hollow, tasked with counting every armor, icon citizen, for the war effort. What he found in that cabin defied every category on his government forms. Children who couldn't identify their own parents, adults whose family relationships formed impossible loops, and at the center of it all, 18-year-old Lily Mae, pregnant again, nursing a toddler, while a severely disabled child lay neglected in the corner. Klein's official report filed with the state of Kentucky described the situation in clinical terms that barely concealed his horror. But like so many reports before it, this one was quietly buried in a filing cabinet in Frankfurt. The war was on. Resources were stretched thin. Some problems, the officials decided, were better left undisturbed. That decision would haunt them for years to come. If you're still watching, you are already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? By 1945, the hollow had become a breeding ground for horrors that defied human comprehension. Lily Mae, now 20 years old, had given birth to 4 children by her brother William. Each birth brought new genetic catastrophes: children with webbed fingers, children who seized violently at the sound of their own names, children whose eyes never quite focused on the world around them. The family's isolation was becoming impossible to maintain. Neighbors, what few existed in those remote mountains, began to whisper. Stories spread through the hollers like wildfire, tales of inhuman sounds echoing from the Combs cabin at night, of children who looked more like creatures than human beings, of a woman trapped in a nightmare that seemed to have no end. William had grown increasingly violent as the years passed. The corn liquor that dulled his conscience during the day turned him into something monstrous after dark. Lily May bore the scars of his rage: broken ribs that never healed properly, a jaw that clicked when she spoke, fingers that had been bent backward so many times they no longer straightened completely. But it was the arrival of a traveling photographer in 1947 that finally shattered their wall of secrecy. James Marion, a documentarian capturing the poverty of rural Appalachia for a magazine article, stumbled upon the cabin while following an old hunting trail. What he witnessed there would haunt him for the rest of his life. Marion later described finding Lily May sitting on the cabin's rotting porch, holding an infant whose head was twice the normal size. Behind her, barely visible in the cabin's darkness, other children moved with the jerky, unnatural motions of broken marionettes. The smell that emanated from inside was indeed indescribable: human waste, rotting food, and something else. Something that seemed to reek of genetic despair itself. Marion took no photographs that day. Instead, he drove directly to the county seat and filed a report with the sheriff's department. This time the authorities couldn't ignore what was happening in the hollow. This time there would be consequences. But the Combs family had spent generations perfecting their ability to hide from the outside world. When the sheriff's deputies arrived 3 days later, they found an empty cabin and cold ashes in the fireplace. The family had vanished into the mountains like smoke, taking their cursed bloodline deeper into the wilderness. For 5 years, they would remain ghosts, living in caves and abandoned mining shacks, always one step ahead of the law. But you can't run forever from the darkness you carry inside. The summer of 1952 brought the worst drought in Kentucky's recorded history. Rivers that had run for centuries turned to dust, wells that had never failed went dry, and in their desperate search for water, the Combs family was forced to emerge from the shadows they had called home for 5 years. Margaret Hensley, the social worker, whose Ford had wound through those mountain roads, had been tracking reports of the family for months. Missing children from neighboring counties, sightings of figures moving through the forest at night, farmers finding evidence that someone or something had been living in their barns and root cellars. When she finally found them, they had taken shelter in an abandoned coal mine outside Harlan County. The family had grown during their years in hiding. Lily May, now 27, had given birth to 2 more children in the darkness of caves and mine shafts. The total count was staggering: 6 children born of incest, each one bearing the physical and mental scars of their poisoned bloodline. Margaret's field notes, discovered decades later in a water-damaged box in the state archives, paint a picture of human suffering that defies comprehension. The children ranged in age from 3 to 14, but none functioned at an age-appropriate level. The eldest, Thomas, had developed into something barely recognizable as human. His growth stunted, his behavior animalistic, his communication limited to guttural sounds and violent gestures. William, now in his 30s, had become something out of a backwoods nightmare. Years of living wild had stripped away whatever thin veneer of civilization he had once possessed. His eyes held no recognition of human law or morality. When Margaret attempted to interview him about the children's parentage, he responded with threats so graphic and disturbing that she couldn't bring herself to record them in her own official report. But it was Lily May who haunted Margaret the most. The woman sitting before her was ancient beyond her years, her face carved with lines of suffering that spoke of horrors no human should endure. When Margaret asked about the children's fathers, Lily May simply pointed to William and whispered, "They're all his, every last one of them." The state of Kentucky faced an unprecedented crisis. What do you do with a family so damaged by generations of incest that the very concept of Rehabilitation seemed impossible. How do you prosecute crimes when the victims and perpetrators are so psychologically destroyed that they can barely comprehend the concept of right and wrong? The decision they reached would remain classified for 40 years. The children were quietly removed and scattered across state institutions, their names changed, their histories erased. William was committed to a psychiatric facility where he would spend the rest of his life in solitary confinement, and Lily May, the most cursed daughter in Kentucky's history, simply vanished from all official records. What happened to Lily May Combs in the summer of 1952 remains one of Kentucky's most closely guarded secrets. The official record states simply that she was relocated for treatment, but no hospital, no institution, no facility has any record of her admission. It's as if the state of Kentucky made a collective decision that Lily May Combs had never existed at all. The children fared little better, scattered across institutions from Louisville to Lexington. They were given new names, new identities, new histories carefully crafted to hide the truth of their origins. Most never lived to see their 30th birthdays. The genetic damage that ran through their bloodline proved too severe, too deeply embedded in their very DNA to overcome. Thomas, the eldest, died in 1967 at the Western Kentucky State Hospital. The official cause of death was listed as complications from developmental disabilities, but nurses who worked the ward whispered of something far more disturbing. They spoke of a young man who had never learned to speak, who communicated only through acts of violence so savage that he had to be kept in restraint 24 hours a day. The younger children didn't fare much better. One by one, they succumbed to seizures, organ failures, and mysterious illnesses that doctors couldn't explain, but were clearly linked to the genetic catastrophe of their birth. By 1975, only one remained alive, a daughter named Mary, who had been placed with a foster family in Ohio and lived under an assumed identity until her death in 2003. But the story doesn't end there. In 1994, a genealogist named Patricia Wells was researching family histories for a client when she stumbled across fragments of the Combs family records in a misfiled folder at the Kentucky State Archives. What she found led her down a rabbit hole of sealed documents, classified reports, and bureaucratic cover-ups that stretched back 50 years. Wells discovered that the state had worked systematically to erase every trace of the Combs family from public records. Birth certificates had been altered, death certificates had been falsified, property records had been destroyed. It was as if an entire bloodline had been wiped from history by a bureaucratic sleight of hand. Even more disturbing were the medical records Wells uncovered. The children removed from the mine shaft in 1952 had undergone extensive genetic testing that revealed chromosomal damage so severe it challenged scientific understanding of human genetics. The report suggested that generations of incest had created something that barely qualified as human, a bloodline so corrupted by its own darkness that it represented a dead end of human evolution. Today, if you drive through the hollows of eastern Kentucky, you won't find any mention of the Combs family. The cabin where Lily May suffered has long since rotted away. The mine where they were discovered has been sealed. Even the local cemetery refuses to acknowledge the graves that lie unmarked in its forgotten corners. But sometimes, on nights, when the mountain mist rolls thick through those shadowed valleys, locals still report hearing things that shouldn't exist. The cries of children who were never meant to be born. The whispers of a woman whose suffering echoes across decades. The reminder that some secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of clawing their way back to the surface. The most cursed daughter in Kentucky's history may have vanished from official records, but her legacy remains. A dark reminder of what happens when humanity's most basic taboos are shattered and the consequences ripple through generations like a genetic nightmare that refuses to die. Some stories are buried for a reason, some bloodlines are meant to end, and sometimes the darkest chapters in American history are the ones we agree never to speak of again.